Welcome back to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Latin reading course. In this video, we'll study Lesson 2, which covers verses 6 through 10 of Chapter 1 of the Gospel of John. In this lesson, we continue our study of St. Jerome's Latin translation of the Gospel of St. John. We are using these lessons to build our Latin vocabulary. In each lesson, we will study 5 verses until we've completed the first 5 chapters of the Gospel. Before we get started, let's review how to study in Latin reading. First, study the lesson exposition carefully and completely. Second, repeat the translation exercises until they can be completed without help from the lesson. Third, memorize all lesson vocabulary. And fourth, work to earn a perfect score on the lesson assessment without help from the lesson. If you follow these instructions, you'll have great success with Latin reading. In this lesson, we're going to study verses 6 through 10, so let's begin by simply reading through the entire passage together, focusing on Latin pronunciation. Verse 6, Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7, Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Verse 8, Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Verse 9, Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. Verse 10, In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non cognovit. Let's now focus on verse 6. Fuit homo missus a Deo, qui nomen erat Ioannes. Let's now learn the meaning of each word in verse 6. Remember that in some lessons, words may be left out of the list because we've already studied them in previous lessons. Verse 6 reads, Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. The first word, fuit, is a verb that means was. Homo is a substantive noun that means man. Fuit homo, there was a man. Missus means sent. A is a preposition that means from, and Deo is another form of the Latin word that means God. A Deo, from God. Cui is a pronoun that means for whom. Nomen is a substantive noun that means name. Erat, as we've learned before, is a verb which means was. Note the difference between erat here, which is translated was, and fuit, which at the beginning of this line is also translated was. There is an important difference between these two verbs, which you'll learn in Latin grammar. Lastly, Ioannes, which is a proper substantive noun. It's the name of a man, John, Ioannes. Now let's study the translation of verse 6. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Fuit is translated there was. Notice that there is put in parentheses because we use that to make the English translation clearer. There was, fuit, homo, a man. Fuit homo, there was a man. Missus means sent, a Deo, from God. There was a man sent from God. Cui, for whom, nomen, the name, erat, was, Ioannes, John. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. There was a man sent from God, for whom the name was John. Now in English, we wouldn't say for whom the name was John. We would say whose name was John. And this is why it's important for us to learn a literal translation of every word as we study Latin, because the expressions in Latin are not the same as they are in English. So if you are going to try and write or speak Latin and try to say whose name was John, it would be difficult because that's not how it was expressed in Latin. In Latin, they would say for whom the name was John. Note the yellow note here on your screen. The verbs est, erat, sunt, fuit are different forms of the verb esse, which means to be. These are very common, very important verbs in Latin. Even though they look different, again, look at that list, est, erat, sunt, fuit. Even though they look different, they're all different forms of just one verb. And so it's important for us to learn this, and we study all of these forms in Latin grammar. Now, these verbs may be translated in different ways based on their different forms. We'll see one of them translated as he, she, or it is, they are, he, she, or it was, and so on. And again, the reason for these different translations has to do with the forms of these different verbs. Here, at the beginning, for fuit, we see the translation there was, which is also an option. There's no way for you to understand the differences of all of these forms through a Latin reading course. That's why it's important to make sure you're getting started with the study of Latin grammar. In these Latin reading lessons, you can learn by my instruction the translations. But if you really want to understand the translations, and if you want to be able to translate on your own other readings in Latin, you're going to need to master Latin grammar. Now let's move on to the next verse, verse 7. But as before, we'll read both verses 6 and 7 to practice our Latin pronunciation. Verse 6. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Let's learn the meaning of each word in verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. The first word, hic, is a pronoun that means this. Venit is a verb that means came. Then we see the preposition in, but notice here this preposition, which we've seen a number of times already in the first 6 verses of the Gospel of St. John. Notice it has a different translation. Here, in is translated for. We then see the substantive noun testimonium, which means testimony. We then see the conjunction ut, which means so that, and we see testimonium again. We then see a verb, perhiberet, which means might give, or he might give. We then have the preposition de, which means concerning here, and lumine, which means light. We then have the conjunction ut again, so that. We then have omnes, which is related to omnia, which we saw in lesson 1. This is the same form of that adjective noun. It means all. We then have the verb crederent, which means might believe. Then we have the preposition per, which means by or through. Here it's translated by. And lastly, illum, the pronoun that means him. Now let's study the translation of verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Hic venit in testimonium. Note that hic means this, but in parentheses I've added man. The reason why is because the pronoun hic is masculine in gender, so it doesn't just mean this. It refers to a noun that's masculine. And so I put man in parentheses there. This man, hic, venit, came, in testimonium, for a testimony. He came for a testimony. Ut, so that, testimonium, a testimony, perhiberet, he might give. De lumine, concerning the light. Ut, so that, omnes, all men, and again, notice that the adjective omnes, as I said, is the same adjective that we saw in the form omnia in the previous lesson. But here, like hic, it's masculine in gender. And you can see that I've put men in parentheses here. Omnes, all men, crederent, might believe, per illum, by him or through him. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. This man came for a testimony, so that a testimony he might give concerning the light, so that all men might believe by him. As I mentioned before, and as you see in the yellow note here, the preposition in is translated in verse 7 as for, and this shows that the pronoun in has more than one possible meaning. It would be good for the student to look up the preposition in a Latin dictionary and note the different meanings of the preposition based on whether it is followed by an accusative or ablative case. You'll be surprised if you look at a Latin dictionary and look up the word in to find how many possible translations there are. And which is the right translation depends on the details of what you're reading. So translation can be very difficult, very, very complicated, and I want you to see that so you don't oversimplify it. But as you study Latin grammar and as you work through Latin reading, you'll learn more and more how to make those decisions in translation, and it'll be no problem at all down the road. So make sure you realize that Latin words have a number of different possible translations, and we use our knowledge of Latin grammar and the context of what we're reading to make decisions about how these words should be translated, and that's called interpretation. Now let's move on to study verse 8. We'll read verses 6 through 8 to continue working on our Latin pronunciation. Verse 6. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Verse 8. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Let's learn the meaning of all the words in verse 8. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. The first word in the sentence is an adverb, non, that means not. Next we have the verb erat, which we've seen many times now. It means was. Ille is the pronoun that means he. And lux, which we've seen before, is a substantive noun that means light. Sed is a new conjunction for us. It means but. Ut is another conjunction we've seen before. It means so that. Testimonium means testimony. It's a noun. Perhiberet is a verb that means he might give. De, a preposition that means concerning. And lumine, a noun that means light. Let's learn the translation now of verse 8. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Non means not, and erat means was. So non erat means not was, or was not in regular English. Ille means he, and lux means the light. Non erat ille lux. Not was he the light. Ille here refers to John the Baptist. Non erat ille lux. Not was he the light, sed, but, ut, so that, testimonium, a testimony, perhiberet, he might give, de, concerning, lumine, the light. Not was he the light, but so that a testimony he might give concerning the light. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Now notice here we've got two nouns, lux and lumine, and they're both translated the light in English. It's important to realize this because this is an example of the benefit of Latin study. These are two different nouns which have the same translation in English. If you were reading an English Bible, you would have no idea that behind the English Bible, in the Latin text, there were two different nouns, because in English all you would see was the light and the light. It would look like the same word. But in Latin, it's not the same word. And this is one of the benefits of being able to study the ancient languages, whether it's Hebrew or Greek or Latin. We can see things in the original language that can't be seen by someone reading a translation. These two words are different. When St. Jerome was translating, he chose to use two different words. He chose to use lux in some places, and he chose to use lumine or lumen in other places. We might wish to know whether there's any important reason why St. Jerome used two different Latin nouns here. It may be important, and this is one of the reasons why men study these ancient languages to see these things behind the scene and understand more clearly the meaning of the texts that we're reading. So ask yourself, or take some time to research on your own and see if you can find out if there's a difference between these two nouns, lux and lumine. I'd be happy to know what you find out. Let's move on now to study verse 9, and we'll read all the verses to continue practicing pronunciation. Verse 6, Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7, Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Verse 8, Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Verse 9, Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. Now let's learn the meaning of every word in verse 9. Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. At the beginning of this verse, we see the verb erat again, which means was. We then see the noun lux, which means light, and vera, which is an adjective noun that means true. So lux vera, light, true. Notice the word order in Latin is different from English. In English, we would say true light. But the order in Latin is to say the noun first and then the adjective. So we have lux vera, light, true. We then see the pronoun quae, which means which. The verb illuminat means, very simply, illuminates. We then have the adjective noun omnem, which means every. This is the same adjective we've seen before in omnia and omnes. Here we have omnem. It's singular, so we don't translate it all, we translate it every. Omnem. We then see the noun hominem, which means man. Earlier in verse 6, we saw the noun homo, which meant man. Here we see hominem, which means man. These are actually two different forms of the same word. So hominem is a form of the noun homo, which we saw before. Venientem is a participle that means coming. Remember, before we saw venit, which means he came. Now we're seeing another form derived from that verb, venientem, same stem, veni. But this is a participle that means coming. We then see the preposition in again with a different translation, into. And lastly, mundum, which means world. Let's learn the translation of verse 9 here. Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. Erat means he was. Lux means the light. He was the light. Vera means true. He was the light, true. Quae illuminat, which illuminates, omnem hominem, every man, venientem, coming, in mundum, into the world. Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem, venientem in mundum. He was the light true, which illuminates every man coming into the world. Take a look at the yellow note here. And notice the two different translations of in that we've seen. We saw in mundo, which translated as in the world. And we saw in mundum here in verse 9, which translates as into the world. The forms of words in Latin determine not only the translations of those words, but the words around them. So here we see two different forms of the noun mundus. We see mundo and mundum. And those different forms have different meanings, but they also determine how the preposition in is going to be translated. We learn about all of these forms and their different translations in Latin grammar, which is why, again, it's important for you to study Latin grammar as you're studying Latin reading. Now we'll move on to the last verse in this lesson, verse 10, but we'll read the entire passage to practice pronunciation. Verse 6, Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7, Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Verse 8, Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Verse 9, Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. And verse 10, In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non coniovit. Notice the pronunciation of that last word, coniovit. In ecclesiastical Latin, that combination of the letter G and N is pronounced with nia, like lasagna, nia. In classical Latin, it would have been gna, cognovit. But in ecclesiastical Latin, it's coniovit. Let's now learn the meaning of all the words in verse 10. Note that all the words in the verse are not listed here because we've already seen them, and we'd like to be able to move through these lessons as quickly as possible, which is a reminder of why it's so important to memorize the vocabulary in every lesson. Verse 10, In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non coniovit. We have at the beginning of the sentence the preposition in, which means in here. We then have mundo, which is a substantive noun that means world. In mundo, in the world. Erat is the verb we've seen before, was, in the world was. Et is the conjunction and. Mundus is another form of that same noun we've seen. It means the world. Per is a preposition that means by or through, and ipsum means him. Factus, we've seen that before. It's a participle that means made, and est is a verb that means is. Et, the conjunction, means and. Mundus, the world. Eum, a pronoun that means him. Non, the adverb that means not. And coniovit, which means knew or did know. Let's learn the translation of verse 10. In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non coniovit. In mundo erat, in the world he was. Et mundus, and the world, per ipsum, through him, factus est, made, is. Et mundus, and the world, eum, him, non cognovit, not did know. In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non cognovit. In the world he was, and the world through him made is, and the world him not did know. Take a look at the yellow note. Note that in this verse we see a third form of the noun translated as the world in English. We've seen mundo, we've seen mundum, and now we see mundus. Three different forms of the same word. And if you pay careful attention, this is a good challenge for you. You can figure out what's different about the forms and how they're used in the sentences in these different places. It's a good challenge to think about. But in Latin grammar, you'll learn all of the forms of Latin, and you'll learn why these different forms are used. We've now finished all of the verses for this lesson. We've learned the meaning of all the words and the translation of all the lines. Now it's good for us to review the entire passage, verses 6 through 10. It's good for you to test yourself and see as we read through the Latin if you can understand all of it. It's okay if you don't, especially if you're just getting started and have just watched through this video. Remember, this video is intended for you to watch again and again, or to back up and rewatch different parts. So you should continue studying until you get to a point where you can read through these verses and understand everything you read. That's the ultimate test of your Latin reading. So let's read through verses 6 through 10 one last time. And as we do, practice your pronunciation, but also test yourself and see whether you understand everything we read. If there's anything you don't understand, make a note of it and go back and review the lesson. Verse 6. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Verse 8. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Verse 9. Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. And verse 10. In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non cognovit. Before we finish up this lesson, let's make sure we review the instructions for how to study in Latin reading. First, make sure you study the lesson exposition carefully and completely. Second, repeat the translation exercises until they can be completed without help from the lesson. Third, memorize all lesson vocabulary. And fourth, work to earn a perfect score on the lesson assessment without help from the lesson. Note that when you earn a passing score, you can move on to the next lesson, but you should continue to review and work to earn a perfect score on each lesson assessment and be able to do so without any help from the lesson. If you follow these instructions, you'll do very well in Latin reading. I hope that you've enjoyed this video in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Latin Reading 1 course. In this video, we went over Lesson 2, in which we study St. Jerome's Latin translation of the Gospel of St. John, chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. If you have any questions about the lesson, if there's anything that's not clear or you'd like more help with, feel free to contact us anytime. Help is always available. God bless your studies. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy works to research, restore, publish, and teach the classical liberal arts, classical philosophy, and Catholic theology for students of all ages. To learn more about the Academy, visit our website at classicalliberalarts.com. God bless.